Case 1. Samuel Little. In 2018, the FBI released a gallery to the public that stunned investigators across the country. 93 portraits, drawn in colored pencil and pastel, each one depicting a woman's face. The portraits were photorealistic, rendered with an artist's precision and an unsettling intimacy. They had been drawn from memory by the man who had murdered every one of them. Some of the sketches created more than 4 decades after he had strangled his victims and dumped their bodies in woods and alleys across America. Samuel Little possessed an eidetic memory, a trait so rare that it allowed him to recall, with perfect clarity, the faces of women he had killed between 1970 and 2005. That same extraordinary memory, the gift that had helped him evade detection for 35 years, became the evidence that would close 93 cold cases and confirm him as the most prolific serial killer in United States history. Samuel McDowell, who used the alias Samuel Little, was born on June 7, 1940, in Reynolds, Georgia. He was raised by his grandmother in a chaotic household. Little later claimed his mother had worked as a sex worker, though the claim was never verified. He dropped out of high school and drifted through a series of transient jobs, working as an amateur boxer, an ambulance attendant, and a day laborer. He had no professional credentials, no stable address, and no ties to any community. Between 1956 and 2012, Little was arrested more than 100 times across 24 states on charges that included assault, armed robbery, and rape. He was convicted on some charges, acquitted on others, and repeatedly released back onto the streets. Psychologists who examined him decades later diagnosed him with antisocial personality disorder. He was indigent, transient, and forgettable. To the women he targeted, he was invisible. To police departments across the country, he was a nuisance, not a priority. One of those women was Martha Cunningham. She was 34 years old in 1975, a church pianist and singer in Knoxville, Tennessee. She was beloved by her congregation, her parents, and her siblings. She was devout, kind, and deeply involved in her church community. On a day in 1975, she was running errands before a church service when she crossed paths with Samuel Little. She was walking alone in a lower-income area of Knoxville, a detail that made her vulnerable, not because of who she was, but because of what Little believed about the police. He chose his victims carefully, targeting women he thought would be dismissed, women whose deaths he believed would not be investigated with urgency or care. Martha Cunningham was not a sex worker, not a drug user, not transient. She was a woman of faith whose life mattered to everyone who knew her. Little killed her anyway. Little's method was consistent across 35 years. He cruised in his vehicle, scanning the streets for women who fit his preferred demographics. When he found a target, he abducted her. He used his skills as an amateur boxer to deliver a knockout punch, rendering the victim unconscious. Then he strangled her manually, watching as the life drained from her body. The killing was not quick. It was deliberate, sustained, and motivated by what investigators later described as extreme sexual sadism. After the murder, Little dumped the body in a location designed to delay discovery. In Martha Cunningham's case, he left her in a wooded area outside Knoxville. Her body was found weeks later by civilian hunters. The death was initially misclassified as natural or accidental, a catastrophic investigative failure that allowed Little to continue killing. He fled Tennessee within 24 hours and moved on to his next victim. By the time Martha Cunningham's family had buried her, Little had already selected another woman to murder. He would kill 93 people over the course of his life, all of them adults, all of them women. He later told investigators that God had put him on earth to do this. For decades, the murders remained unsolved. Little had been arrested for similar assaults in multiple states, but juries acquitted him, often because his victims were sex workers or drug users whose credibility was attacked in court. Investigators missed red flags repeatedly. The bodies piled up in different jurisdictions, and no one connected them. Little's transient lifestyle meant he left no paper trail, no permanent address, no employment records that could be tracked. He was a ghost. That invisibility ended in 2012 when a DNA match from a cold case in California flagged his name in a criminal database. He was arrested on September 5, 2012, at a homeless shelter in Louisville, Kentucky, and charged with murder. The case that brought him down was not Martha Cunningham's. It was a killing in Los Angeles, decades old, that had finally been linked to him through forensic technology that did not exist in 1975. The investigation that connected Little to dozens of other murders began with Texas Ranger James Holland. Holland had built a reputation as an interrogator who could elicit confessions from the most hardened criminals. And in 2018, he sat down with Samuel Little in a California prison. What followed was a series of interviews that would rewrite the history of American serial murder. Little, by then 78 years old and in failing health, began to talk. He was not remorseful. He was not seeking redemption. He was seeking recognition. He wanted the world to know what he had done, and he wanted credit for every single victim. Over the course of multiple sessions, Little confessed to 93 murders spanning 35 years. He provided details that only the killer could know: the locations of bodies, the years of the killings, the methods he had used, and then he did something that investigators had never seen before. He drew portraits of his victims from memory, sketching their faces with astonishing accuracy. Some of the women he had killed in the 1970s. He drew them in 2018, more than 40 years later, and the likenesses were precise enough that investigators were able to identify victims whose names had been lost to time. The trial that convicted Little took place in September 2014 in Los Angeles County Superior Court. Prosecutor Beth Silverman presented evidence linking Little to 3 murders through DNA recovered from the crime scenes. The semen found on the victims matched Little's genetic profile, and surviving women who had been attacked by Little in the 1980s testified about his modus operandi. The defense, led by attorney Michael Pentella, argued that the DNA evidence was circumstantial and that Little, now in his 70s, was a frail and harmless old man. The jury was not persuaded. After 2 hours of deliberation, they convicted Samuel Little of 3 counts of first-degree murder on September 25, 2014. Judge George G. Lamelli sentenced him the same day to 3 consecutive terms of life in prison without the possibility of parole. Little showed no emotion when the verdict was read. Families of the victims wept quietly in the courtroom. Prosecutor Silverman told reporters afterward, "He is an evil monster." The sentencing did not end the case. In 2018, while serving his sentence at California State Prison in Los Angeles County, Little began his confessions to Texas Ranger Holland. He traded the information for a prison transfer to Texas, where conditions were more favorable. He detailed 93 murders, drawing the portraits and providing locations. The FBI verified his confessions using the sketches, cross-referencing them with missing persons reports and unsolved homicides across the country. Investigators confirmed that Little had targeted women who were marginalized, women whose disappearances had not triggered intensive investigations. He had chosen his victims because he believed they did not matter to the police. He was, in many cases, correct. The FBI released the gallery of sketches to the public in an effort to identify the remaining Jane Does and give their families closure. Many of those families had waited decades for answers. Some received them. Others are still waiting. Samuel Little died on December 30th, 2020, at the age of 80, of natural causes. He never expressed remorse. The trait that made him extraordinary, the eidetic memory that allowed him to recall every face with perfect clarity, became the key to solving 93 murders. Martha Cunningham's family, 43 years after her death, finally learned who had killed her. The FBI overhauled its violent criminal apprehension program to better track cases involving marginalized victims across state lines, a reform that came far too late for the women Samuel Little murdered. The portraits remain, haunting evidence of a predator who operated in plain sight for 35 years, killing women he believed the world had already forgotten. Case 2, Richard Cottingham. Firefighters responding to a smoke alarm at the Travel Inn Motor Hotel on West 42nd Street in New York City on the morning of December 2, 1979, discovered a scene that belonged in a horror film. Inside room 417, flames were consuming the walls and furniture, and thick smoke poured into the hallway. When the fire was extinguished, investigators found 2 bodies on the bed. Both were headless. Both were missing their hands. The heads and hands had been removed with such precision that investigators knew immediately this was not an act of frenzy. It was calculated, methodical, and designed to prevent identification. Lighter fluid cans were scattered around the room, evidence that the fire had been set deliberately to destroy forensic evidence. The torsos were all that remained of 2 women whose names were not yet known. The man who killed them was Richard Francis Cottingham, a 32-year-old mainframe computer operator at Blue Cross Blue Shield in New Jersey, a quiet suburban father of 3 who lived an unremarkable life in a middle-class neighborhood. By night, he prowled the streets of Times Square, renting motel rooms and torturing women in acts of sadism so extreme that he earned the nickname the Torso Killer. Richard Francis Cottingham was born on November 25, 1946, in the Bronx, New York. He was raised in a middle-class household by strict parents and appeared to have a conventional upbringing. He graduated from high school, married a woman named Janet, and started a family. By the late 1970s, he was working as a mainframe computer operator for Blue Cross Blue Shield, a stable corporate job that required technical skill and provided a comfortable income. He and Janet had 3 children, and the family lived in a suburban home in New Jersey. To neighbors, co-workers, and even his own wife, Cottingham was unremarkable. He was quiet, unassuming, and forgettable. He had no significant criminal record before the murders began, only minor traffic violations. Psychologists who examined him after his arrest diagnosed him with severe sexual sadism. What no one knew was that Cottingham maintained a complete double life. He told his wife he was working overnight shifts or playing poker with friends. In reality, he was driving to Times Square, picking up sex workers, and torturing them in motel rooms. He kept a murder kit in his work briefcase, handcuffs, knives, and other tools he used to restrain and mutilate his victims. One of those victims was Dita Goodarzi. She was 22 years old, a sex worker working the Times Square area in 1979. She was the mother of a young daughter and was trying to survive in a profession that left her vulnerable to predators like Cottingham. She was marginalized, desperate for money, and willing to take the risk of getting into a car with a stranger. Goodarzi's daughter, who was too young to remember her mother when she died, now leads a national missing persons advocacy group, dedicating her life to identifying Jane Does and giving families the closure that was denied to her for so many years. Dita Goodarzi hired Richard Cottingham as a client on the night of December 1979. She had no way of knowing that the quiet, bespectacled man who approached her was one of the most dangerous killers operating in New York City. What happened in room 417 of the Travel Inn Motor Hotel was the culmination of years of escalating violence. Cottingham rented the room and brought Goodarzi and another woman inside. Over the course of several hours, he tortured them. He used handcuffs to restrain them, then strangled both women. After they were dead, he decapitated them and removed their hands to prevent identification through fingerprints or dental records. The mutilations were post-mortem, carried out with a level of precision that suggested he had done this before. He poured lighter fluid around the room and set the fire, then left the hotel and took the subway to his office, where he sat at his computer terminal and worked his shift as though nothing had happened. Hotel staff smelled the smoke within an hour of his departure and called the fire department. FDNY firefighters arrived within minutes and discovered the bodies. The investigation began immediately. The crime scene yielded critical evidence. The bodies bore deep bite marks on the remaining tissue, a detail that would become central to the prosecution's case. The bite marks were unique, matching the specific structure of Cottingham's teeth. Investigators also recovered the lighter fluid cans and determined that the fire had been set deliberately. The hotel clerk provided a description of the man who had rented the room. White, bespectacled, wearing a jacket. It was not enough to identify him immediately, but it was a start. 6 months later, on May 22, 1980, Richard Cottingham was caught fleeing a similar attack at the Quality Inn in Hasbrouck Heights, New Jersey. A maid had heard screams coming from one of the rooms and called the police. Officers arrived and found Cottingham attempting to leave the building. Inside the room, they found a woman who had been brutally assaulted but was still alive. Her name was Leslie Ann Odell, and her testimony would help convict him. When police searched Cottingham's home, they found what prosecutors later described as a trophy room. Hidden in the house, right next to where his children slept, were items belonging to his victims: jewelry, identification cards, and personal effects. He had kept souvenirs of the women he had murdered and stored them in his family home. The trial began in June 1981 in Bergen County Courthouse in New Jersey. Judge Fred C. Galda presided over a case that would stretch across multiple jurisdictions, as prosecutors in both New Jersey and New York sought to hold Cottingham accountable for murders committed in their states. Prosecutor John Fahey presented forensic evidence linking Cottingham to the crimes. The bite marks, the handcuffs found in his home that matched marks on victims' wrists, and the trophy items recovered from his house. The defense, led by attorney John Langan, questioned the reliability of the eyewitness accounts and the surviving victim's testimony, but the physical evidence was overwhelming. Leslie Ann Odell took the stand and described the hours of torture she had endured before police arrived. The jury heard her testimony and saw the photographs of the trophy room. After 8 hours of deliberation, they convicted Richard Cottingham of multiple counts of murder. The courtroom erupted in screams of relief and applause from the victims' families. Sentencing came in July 1981. Judge Fred C. Galda imposed a sentence of over 200 years across multiple jurisdictions, all terms to be served consecutively. Families of the victims gave impact statements expressing their horror at the mutilations and the knowledge that Cottingham had kept pieces of their loved ones as trophies. Cottingham remained completely silent during the proceedings. Judge Galda called the crimes unfathomable and barbaric. The prosecutor praised the bravery of the surviving victims who had testified. The families left the courthouse with the knowledge that Cottingham would never leave prison. All procedural appeals were denied, and Cottingham settled into a life sentence. But beginning in the 2010s, he began giving what he called final confessions to cold case detectives. He traded information about unsolved murders for immunity from further prosecution, slowly doling out details to feed his ego and maintain relevance. He confessed to over 100 murders, though only 18 have been confirmed. The confessions came in drips, each one carefully timed to maximize attention. Forensic odontology, the science of matching bite marks to dental structure, became controversial in later years. But Cottingham's own confessions rendered the debate moot. He admitted to everything. Richard Cottingham is 77 years old. He is incarcerated at New Jersey State Prison in Trenton where he is serving multiple life sentences with no possibility of parole. His inmate number is 63130. He frequently grants interviews to podcasters and historians, drawn to the attention and the opportunity to brag about his intelligence and the scope of his crimes. Dita Goodarzi's daughter has dedicated her life to identifying other Jane Does and giving families the closure that was denied to her. The Netflix docuseries, Crime Scene, The Times Square Killer, brought renewed attention to the case. The extreme juxtaposition remains the most shocking element of the story. A suburban family man who sat at a computer terminal during the day and dismembered women in Times Square hotel rooms at night, storing their jewelry in his home while his children slept in the next room. Case 3. Gary Ray Bowles. The confession came during an interrogation after his arrest, delivered in a flat, matter-of-fact tone that made the horror of it worse. Gary Ray Bowles told investigators why he had stuffed objects down the throats of the 6 men he murdered along the Interstate 95 corridor in 1994. He wanted to make sure they could not ask God for help. The signature was grotesque and deliberate, a final act of cruelty inflicted on men who had shown him kindness when he had nowhere else to go. Between March and November of 1994, Bowles killed 6 men in 8 months, moving from state to state, befriending his victims in bars, accepting shelter in their homes, then murdering them while they slept, and stealing their cars and credit cards. He was a drifter, a transient laborer, and a sex worker who despised the very men he depended on for survival. When he was arrested in November 1994, he confessed to everything. 25 years later, Florida executed him by lethal injection. Gary Ray Bowles was born on January 25, 1962, in Clifton Forge, Virginia. His childhood was marked by severe abuse at the hands of a stepfather who beat him regularly. Bowles left home at the age of 14 and never returned. He dropped out of high school and spent the next several decades drifting across the country, working occasional manual labor jobs and surviving through sex work. He married briefly, but the marriage ended in divorce. He had no children. His criminal record included convictions for assault, robbery, and burglary, and he had served time in prison for beating a girlfriend. He was homeless, broke, and dependent on alcohol and drugs. Those who encountered him in the early 1990s described him as large, intimidating, and unpredictable. He worked as a sex worker, serving gay men while harboring a deep, displaced rage against them. He lived off their generosity, accepted their money and their shelter, and then killed them. One of the men he killed was Walter Hinton. Hinton was 47 years old in November 1994, a florist and small business owner in Jacksonville Beach, Florida. He was single, well-liked in his community, and known for his kindness. He met Gary Bowles at a bar one evening and, out of pity, offered him a place to stay. Hinton lived alone, and his trusting nature made him vulnerable. He saw a man who needed help and extended a hand. That decision cost him his life. Hinton was remembered by the local LGBTQ+ community as a gentleman whose generosity was exploited by someone he had tried to help. The murder followed a pattern Bowles had established across multiple states. He met men in bars, drank heavily with them, and accepted invitations to stay at their homes. Once inside, he waited until his victim was asleep, then attacked. The method was consistent: bludgeoning, strangulation, and the signature act of stuffing an object, usually toilet paper or a towel, down the victim's throat. In Walter Hinton's case, the attack occurred overnight in Hinton's home in Jacksonville Beach. Bowles beat him, strangled him, and shoved the object into his throat. Then he stole Hinton's wallet and car and fled. He had done this before. He would do it again. Between March and November of 1994, Bowles killed 6 men using the same method, moving along the I-95 corridor from Florida to Maryland. The robberies were opportunistic, but the throat stuffing was ritualistic. He later told investigators that he did it so the men could not ask for help from God, a statement so devoid of empathy that it shocked even hardened detectives. The murder was discovered when friends of Walter Hinton became alarmed that he had not opened his flower shop. They requested a welfare check, and police responded the same morning. Hinton's body was found in his home within 48 hours of his death. The toilet paper stuffed into his throat identified the crime as part of a series. Investigators recovered fingerprints from household items Bowles had touched and found that he had used Hinton's credit cards at ATMs along the highway. Security cameras captured his image at multiple locations. Bartenders who had seen Hinton with Bowles the night before provided descriptions. The FBI launched a cross-country manhunt. Bowles's pattern of dropping his own identification documents and probation papers at crime scenes made him easier to track than most fugitives. He had been arrested previously for violent attacks on men, but had been released on parole. On November 22, 1994, he was arrested in Jacksonville, Florida, where he had been living under an alias. Because Bowles confessed immediately upon arrest and entered a guilty plea, the case moved directly to the penalty phase. The proceedings took place in 1996 in Duval County Courthouse in Florida, with Judge Richard Townsend presiding. The jury heard testimony from medical examiners who described the brutal nature of the deaths and the significance of the throat-stuffing signature. Prosecutor Bernie de la Rionda presented Bowles's own recorded confessions, in which he admitted to all 6 murders and explained his motive. The defense argued that Bowles had suffered severe childhood trauma and had been in an alcohol-fueled blackout state during the killings, but the jury was not persuaded. The crimes were too methodical, too consistent, and too calculated to have been committed in a state of diminished capacity. The jury deliberated for less than a day and returned a verdict recommending the death penalty. Bowles was sentenced to death, but the sentence was overturned on a technicality. In 1999, he was resentenced to death by Judge Townsend. The resentencing hearing included victim impact statements from the families of the men Bowles had killed. They spoke of the kindness their loved ones had shown to a stranger and the cruelty with which that kindness had been repaid. Bowles apologized during the hearing and told the court he deserved to die. Judge Townsend called the crimes heinous, atrocious, and cruel, language that satisfied the legal standard for the death penalty in Florida. Prosecutors expressed satisfaction with the outcome. The families left the courthouse with a sense of relief, knowing that Bowles would remain on death row. He spent the next 23 years in Florida State Prison, filing standard death row appeals that focused on his mental capacity and childhood trauma. All were denied. In 2018, he gave a comprehensive final confession to investigators, detailing all 6 murders in an effort to clear his soul before execution. The Supreme Court denied his final stay of execution in August 2019. Gary Ray Bowles was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison on August 22, 2019. He was 57 years old. His inmate number was 08350E1. The case highlighted the need for better FBI coordination in tracking serial killers who target the LGBTQ+ community across state lines, a population that had historically been underserved by law enforcement. The throat-stuffing signature remains one of the most disturbing details in modern serial killer history. Walter Hinton offered shelter to a homeless man and was murdered for his kindness. Bowles left his own identification at crime scenes repeatedly, a pattern of carelessness that ultimately led to his arrest. The cruelty of the statement that he stuffed objects down his victims' throats so they could not ask for help from God defines the case in the public memory and will likely outlast every other detail. Case 4, Wayne Adam Ford. On November 3, 1998, a man walked into the Humboldt County Sheriff's Office in California, approached the receptionist at the front desk, and began to cry. He told her he needed to speak to someone immediately. When a deputy arrived, the man reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a Ziploc bag. Inside the bag was a severed human breast. "I'm a serial killer," he said. "I have a problem." The man was Wayne Adam Ford, a 36-year-old long-haul truck driver who had been using his commercial sleeper cab as a mobile torture chamber. He had killed 4 women, keeping their bodies in the truck for days as he drove his routes across California. When he could no longer tolerate what he was doing, he stopped himself in the only way he knew how. He cut a piece from one of his victims, put it in a plastic bag, and turned himself in. It is extraordinarily rare for a functioning serial killer to voluntarily surrender to police while actively evading detection. Wayne Adam Ford did exactly that. Wayne Adam Ford was born on December 3rd, 1961, in Petaluma, California. His parents divorced when he was young, and he was described as a troubled loner during his adolescence. He graduated from high school and went on to work as a long-haul truck driver, earning a commercial driver's license and spending weeks at a time on the road. He married twice, and both marriages ended in divorce. He had 1 son. His criminal record included minor offenses, cruelty to animals, assault, and solicitation of prostitution. He struggled with severe depression and alcoholism, and those who knew him said he was quiet and kept to himself. What they did not know was that Ford had developed necrophilic urges that escalated into murder. He carried tools and tarps in his truck specifically for disposing of bodies. He told co-workers that the smell coming from his sleeper cab was rotting food. It was not. One of his victims was Tina Renee Gibbs. She was 26 years old when she disappeared in June 1998. She was transient, unemployed, and estranged from her family. She was hitchhiking in Las Vegas when Wayne Ford picked her up. Hitchhikers trusted truck drivers to give them safe passage, and that trust made them vulnerable. Gibbs had no way of knowing that the man offering her a ride was a predator who had already killed and would kill again. Ford's method was consistent. He picked up women who were hitchhiking or working as sex workers, paid them for sex, then strangled them in the sleeper cab of his truck. He kept their bodies in the cab for days, sometimes longer, as he continued to drive his commercial routes. The crimes were motivated by necrophilia and extreme sadism. He was deliberate and methodical, carrying the tools he needed to restrain and kill his victims. After he tired of the bodies, he dumped them in remote locations, aqueducts, logging roads, places where discovery would be delayed. In some cases, he dismembered the victims to prevent identification. 4 women were confirmed killed by Ford, though investigators believe there may have been more. He operated across California, and the transient nature of his work made it difficult to track his movements. The crimes remained unsolved until Ford walked into the sheriff's office. There had been no major investigation, no suspect profile, no manhunt. The murders were scattered across jurisdictions and had not been linked. Ford's decision to surrender shocked investigators. Just before turning himself in, he called his ex-wife and confessed over the phone. She later testified that he told her he could not stop himself and that he was afraid of what he would do next. When he walked into the Humboldt County Sheriff's Office and presented the severed breast as evidence, deputies immediately took him into custody. He led them to the locations where he had dumped the bodies, and investigators were able to recover remains and confirm his confessions. DNA evidence found in the cab of his truck linked him to the victims. Ford was arrested on the spot and charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder. Prosecutor Paul Gallegos sought the death penalty. Ford initially pled guilty, waiving his right to a trial. The case proceeded to the penalty phase, where the jury would decide whether he should be sentenced to death or life in prison. The trial took place in June 2006 in San Bernardino Superior Court, with Judge Michael A. Smith presiding. Prosecutors emphasized the gruesome nature of the crimes, presenting evidence of the dismemberment and the length of time Ford had kept the bodies in his truck. The defense argued that Ford's voluntary confession and surrender had saved lives and demonstrated that he wanted help. They pointed to his history of mental illness and his obvious distress at the time of his surrender. His brother and ex-wife testified on his behalf, describing his struggles with depression. Ford sobbed openly in the courtroom, but did not formally testify. The most damaging evidence was the Ziploc bag he had brought to the police station, a piece of physical evidence so shocking that it overshadowed everything else. After several days of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict recommending the death penalty on June 27, 2006. Sentencing took place on August 11, 2006. Judge Michael A. Smith acknowledged the rarity of a serial killer voluntarily surrendering, but said the crimes were too horrific for mercy. Families of the victims expressed disgust at Ford's necrophilia and the degradation their loved ones had suffered. Ford apologized through tears. The prosecutor told the court, he turned himself in because he was losing his mind, not out of true mercy. Ford was sentenced to death. In 2019, California placed a moratorium on the death penalty, which means Ford is effectively serving life in prison without the possibility of parole. The case led to increased awareness of long-haul truckers as potential serial offenders and contributed to the creation of the FBI's Highway Serial Killings Initiative, a program designed to track and investigate murders committed by truck drivers along interstate corridors. Wayne Adam Ford is 62 years old. He is incarcerated at San Quentin State Prison in California. His inmate number is V43YOI-23. He has no possibility of parole. He has been described as a quiet inmate who does not seek attention. The image of a man walking into a police station, crying, and pulling a severed body part from his pocket remains one of the most surreal moments in American criminal history. It is incredibly rare for a serial killer to stop himself. Rarer still for one to confess without being caught first. Ford's surrender closed 4 murder cases instantly, but it could not erase the horror of what he had done in the sleeper cab of his truck. Tina Renee Gibbs and 3 other women died there, and their families were left to grapple with the knowledge that a man who knew he was a monster kept killing until he could no longer live with himself. Case 5. Keith Hunter Jesperson. The confessions appeared on the walls of truck stop bathrooms across the Pacific Northwest, scrawled in permanent marker alongside crude drawings of smiley faces. The messages were detailed, specific, and horrifying. They described murders in clinical terms, listing victims by first name or physical description, noting the locations where bodies had been dumped, and providing details that only the killer could know. The author signed each confession with a grinning face, a childish doodle that mocked the gravity of the crimes. Local police dismissed the graffiti as a hoax. They had already arrested and convicted 2 people for one of the murders described in the bathroom stalls, and they believed the case was closed. The graffiti writer was furious. His ego could not tolerate someone else receiving credit for his work. He began sending letters to newspapers and television stations, demanding recognition and providing even more details to prove he was the real killer. The man behind the happy face confessions was Keith Hunter Jesperson, a long-haul truck driver whose profound narcissism ultimately led him to destroy his own freedom in exchange for infamy. Keith Hunter Jesperson was born on April 6, 1955, in Chilliwack, British Columbia. He was raised by a physically abusive father who beat him regularly. As a child, Jesperson tortured animals, a behavior that psychologists later identified as an early warning sign of violent tendencies. He graduated from high school and worked a series of jobs before becoming a long-haul truck driver, earning his commercial driver's license and spending weeks on the road. He married and had 3 children, one of whom, his daughter Melissa Moore. would later speak publicly about what it was like to grow up as the child of a serial killer. Jesperson's marriage ended in divorce, and he was left dealing with alimony and child support payments that strained his finances. He had a history of minor assaults, but no major criminal record before the murders began. Psychologists who examined him diagnosed him with narcissistic personality disorder, a condition defined by an overwhelming need for recognition and an inability to tolerate being overlooked or underestimated. That narcissism would prove to be his undoing. The first woman he killed was Tanja Bennett. She was 23 years old in January 1990, unemployed, and living near her family in the Portland, Oregon area. She was mildly intellectually disabled, a condition that made her trusting and vulnerable to manipulation. On a weekend evening, she went to a bar and met Keith Jesperson. He was large, over 6 feet tall, and more than 200 pounds, but he seemed harmless. They drank together, and he convinced her to come back to his rented home. Once there, they argued. Jesperson later claimed the argument escalated quickly, though the details he provided changed over time. What is certain is that he beat her and strangled her manually. After she was dead, he loaded her body into his car and drove to a remote area where he dumped her near a highway. The body was found the next day by joggers. What happened next became one of the most bizarre twists in American criminal history. A woman named Laverne Pavlinac came forward and confessed to the murder. She claimed that she and her boyfriend, John Sosnovsky, had killed Tanja Bennett together. Pavlinac provided details about the crime scene, though many of those details had already been reported in the media. She said her boyfriend had forced her to participate and that she was terrified of him. Police believed her. Both Pavlinac and Sosnovsky were arrested, tried, and convicted of Tanja Bennett's murder. They were sentenced to prison. The case was closed. Keith Jesperson, the actual killer, watched the news coverage and became enraged. Someone else was getting credit for his murder. His ego would not allow it. He began writing. First, he scrawled confessions on the walls of truck stop bathrooms, detailing the murder and signing them with smiley faces. When police ignored the graffiti, he escalated. He sent letters to newspapers and television stations, providing information that had never been made public. He described the ligature marks on Bennett's neck, the location where he had dumped the body, and details about her clothing. He signed the letters with smiley faces and demanded that the police acknowledge he was the real killer. Investigators were forced to reopen the case. They interviewed Jesperson, and he confessed not only to Tanja Bennett's murder, but to 7 others. He had been killing women across the Pacific Northwest for years, strangling them and dumping their bodies along highways. He carried zip ties and rope in his truck, evidence of premeditation. His motive was a combination of rage and a need for control. He drank heavily before the murders and targeted women he believed would not be missed. Jesperson was arrested in March 1995 in Washougal, Washington. He was charged with multiple counts of murder across several states. Rather than face trial and the possibility of the death penalty, he negotiated plea deals in exchange for multiple life sentences. He confessed to all 8 murders, waiving his right to trial and accepting consecutive life sentences to avoid execution. The evidence against him was overwhelming: his own letters, the bathroom graffiti, and his detailed confessions. Prosecutors in multiple jurisdictions coordinated to ensure he would never be released. The most damaging evidence was his own words, written in permanent marker on bathroom walls and mailed to news outlets in envelopes covered with smiley faces. Sentencing took place in late 1995. Jesperson received 6 consecutive life sentences, ensuring he would never be eligible for parole. Victim impact statements were read by the families of the women he had killed, as well as by Laverne Pavlinac and John Sosnovsky, the 2 innocent people who had been wrongly convicted of Tanja Bennett's murder. Jesperson's confession exonerated them, and they were released from prison. Jesperson smirked during the proceedings and made comments about his size and strength, behaviors that reinforced the judge's assessment of his profound narcissism. The judge condemned him as a man driven entirely by ego, someone who could not tolerate being ignored, even if it meant spending the rest of his life in prison. Keith Jesperson is 69 years old. He is incarcerated at Oregon State Penitentiary, where he is serving 6 consecutive life sentences. His inmate number is 11-6445. He has no possibility of parole. His daughter, Melissa Moore, created a podcast called Shattered Window, in which she discusses what it was like to be raised by a serial killer and how she has worked to build a life separate from his legacy. The bathroom stall confessions, with their grotesque, smiley faces, became the defining image of the case. Jesperson only confessed because he was angry that innocent people were receiving credit for his crimes. That narcissism freed 2 wrongly convicted people from prison, but also ensured that Jesperson himself would die behind bars. Tanja Bennett and 7 other women were killed by a man who cared more about recognition than freedom. A man who could not tolerate being overlooked, even when obscurity was his only path to escape. Case 6. Aileen Wuornos. In 2001, Aileen Wuornos sat on death row in Florida and made a decision that shocked her supporters, her lawyers, and everyone who had followed her case for more than a decade. She fired her legal team and issued a statement to the Supreme Court. "I killed them all, cold as ice," she said. "There was no self-defense. I robbed them. Stop my appeals and execute me." For years, Wuornos had maintained that she had killed 7 men in self-defense, that each one had attacked her or threatened her, and that she had fired her weapon only to save her own life. Her defense attorneys had built their entire strategy around that narrative, arguing that she was a victim of violence who had fought back against her attackers. In 2001, weary of death row and eager to control the final chapter of her story, Wuornos destroyed that narrative herself. She confessed to murder for financial gain and demanded that the state of Florida carry out her execution. 1 year later, Florida did exactly that. Aileen Carol Wuornos was born on February 29, 1956, in Rochester, Michigan. Her childhood was marked by horrific abuse. Her father was a convicted child molester who later committed suicide in prison. Her mother abandoned her when she was young, leaving her to be raised by her grandparents. The abuse continued throughout her childhood. At the age of 14, she gave birth to a son, the result of a sexual assault. The child was given up for adoption. Wuornos dropped out of school in her early teens and began surviving on the streets, working as a sex worker in Michigan and later in Florida. Her criminal record included convictions for prostitution, armed robbery, and assault. She was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder and carried the psychological scars of severe childhood trauma. By the late 1980s, she was homeless, transient, and living out of cars and cheap motels along the highways of Florida. She was in a long-term relationship with a woman named Tyria Moore, and the two moved frequently, surviving on whatever money Wuornos could make from sex work. Wuornos was known to be hostile and unpredictable, and those who encountered her described her as volatile and quick to anger. The first man she killed was Richard Mallory. He was 51 years old, an electronics store owner who picked up Wuornos while she was hitchhiking in Florida in November 1989. Mallory hired her as a sex worker and drove her to a secluded area. What happened next became the central dispute of Wuornos' trial. She claimed that Mallory had attacked her, that he had tried to rape her, and that she had shot him in self-defense. Prosecutors argued that she had killed him to rob him, that she had lured him to the remote location with the intent to steal his money and his car. The truth became more complicated years later, when it was revealed that Richard Mallory was a convicted rapist with a history of violence against women. That information was not introduced at trial, a fact that Wuornos' defense attorneys later cited as grounds for appeal. The revelation gave some credence to her self-defense claim, at least for the first killing. But Wuornos did not stop with Richard Mallory. Between November 1989 and November 1990, Aileen Wuornos killed 7 men along Florida highways. Her method was consistent. She solicited them as a sex worker, drove with them to secluded wooded areas off Interstate 75 and other highways, then shot them with a .22 caliber handgun. After the men were dead, she stole their wallets, their cars, and anything else of value. She stripped the cars for parts and abandoned the vehicles in different locations. She dumped the bodies in the woods, where some were found within days and others were not discovered for weeks. The motive, she would later confess, was robbery. The killings were not acts of self-defense. They were calculated crimes driven by financial desperation and rage. She carried the gun specifically to rob her clients, and she used it 7 times. The investigation began when the bodies started appearing in wooded areas along Florida's highways. Investigators recovered .22 caliber bullets from the victims and noticed similarities in the way the crimes had been committed. The breakthrough came when pawnshop records linked Wuornos to items belonging to the victims. She had pawned cameras and other valuables, and the receipts included her fingerprints and identification. Police also identified Tyria Moore as Wuornos' girlfriend and brought her in for questioning. Moore agreed to cooperate with law enforcement. She wore a wire and called Wuornos, recording conversations in which Wuornos confessed to the killings. The recordings were devastating. Wuornos admitted to the murders and told Moore she was worried about being caught. The tapes provided prosecutors with the evidence they needed to charge her with first-degree murder. Aileen Wuornos was arrested on January 9, 1991, at a biker bar in Volusia County, Florida. She was charged with the murder of Richard Mallory, and additional charges followed as investigators linked her to the other 6 killings. Prosecutor John Tanner built the case around the pawnshop receipts, the recorded confessions, and the physical evidence recovered from the crime scenes. The trial began in January 1992. The defense strategy, led by public defenders, centered on self-defense and battered woman syndrome. They argued that Wuornos had been repeatedly victimized by men throughout her life, and that she had reacted to a perceived threat when she killed Richard Mallory. Prosecutors framed her as a cold-blooded robber who had executed 7 men for money. The most damaging evidence was Tyria Moore's testimony. Moore took the stand and described the details of their life together, the cars Wuornos had stolen, and the confessions Wuornos had made in the recorded phone calls. The jury was not persuaded by the self-defense argument, the pattern of killings, the theft of vehicles, and the repeated use of the same method all pointed to premeditation and financial motive. The jury convicted Aileen Wuornos of first-degree murder. She would eventually receive 6 death sentences, 1 for each subsequent trial. Sentencing for the first conviction came quickly, and Wuornos was placed on death row. She received death sentences in each of the subsequent trials for the other murders. Over the following decade, her case became a cause for those who believed she had been a victim of systemic violence against women, and that her actions, at least in the case of Richard Mallory, had been justified. The revelation that Mallory had been a convicted rapist strengthened that argument. But in 2001, Aileen Wuornos made a decision that ended the debate. She fired her lawyers and issued a comprehensive final confession. She told the Supreme Court and the press that there had been no self-defense, that she had killed all 7 men for money, and that the narrative her lawyers had constructed was a lie. "I killed them all, cold as ice," she said. "I robbed them. Stop my appeals and execute me." The confession shocked her supporters, many of whom had spent years advocating for her. Wuornos demanded that Florida carry out her death sentence, and the state scheduled her execution. Aileen Wuornos was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison on October 9, 2002. She was 46 years old. Her case became the subject of the Academy Award-winning film Monster, in which actress Charlize Theron portrayed Wuornos and won the Oscar for Best Actress. Wuornos is one of the most famous female serial killers in American history, in part because she broke the traditional mold of female killers, who typically use poison rather than firearms. Her final confession remains one of the most dramatic moments in the history of death row appeals. She destroyed her own defense, dismissed her lawyers, and demanded execution. 7 men died along Florida highways between 1989 and 1990. Aileen Wuornos killed them all, and in the end, she admitted it. The self-defense narrative, which had sustained years of legal arguments and public debate, collapsed under the weight of her own words. Her last act of control was to demand her own death. Case 7. Charles Cullen, the nurse who moved from hospital to hospital across New Jersey and Pennsylvania, was described by coworkers as quiet, awkward, and competent. He worked the night shift in intensive care units, where the most vulnerable patients depended entirely on the medical staff assigned to them. He had access to medication cabinets, the authority to administer drugs, and the trust of his colleagues. Between 1988 and 2003, Charles Cullen used that access to kill patients by injecting lethal doses of medications into their IV lines. He was convicted of murdering 29 people, but investigators believe the true number may be as high as 400. What made the case even more shocking was the institutional betrayal that allowed it to continue for 16 years. Multiple hospitals suspected Cullen of harming patients, but rather than report him to law enforcement or medical licensing boards, they quietly fired him and provided neutral references to avoid lawsuits. Those references allowed him to move to the next hospital, where he continued killing. The killing spree ended only when a coworker named Amy Loughran wore a wire and recorded him confessing to the murders. Cullen's comprehensive final confession, delivered as part of a plea deal to avoid the death penalty, revealed the full scope of the cover-up and forced hospitals to confront their complicity. Charles Edmund Cullen was born on February 22, 1960, in West Orange, New Jersey. He graduated from nursing school and earned his registered nurse license, qualifying him to work in critical care settings. He married and had children, but the marriage ended in divorce. He worked as a nurse at multiple hospitals in New Jersey and Pennsylvania, moving frequently between jobs. He had a history of severe depression and made multiple suicide attempts throughout his life, but he was functional enough to maintain employment and pass background checks. He had only minor criminal infractions on his record, mostly trespassing charges unrelated to his work. To his coworkers, Cullen was unremarkable. He was quiet, socially awkward, and not particularly memorable. He kept to himself and performed his duties without drawing attention. What no one knew was that he was accessing medication cabinets during his shifts, withdrawing drugs like digoxin in quantities far exceeding what any patient would need, and injecting those drugs into IV bags. He later claimed that he was providing mercy to patients who were suffering, but many of his victims were not terminal. They were recovering from surgeries, stable, and expected to go home. One of his victims was Reverend Florian Gall. He was 68 years old when he was admitted to Somerset Medical Center in New Jersey in June 2003. Gall was a Catholic priest, bedridden in the intensive care unit, but not in immediate danger. He was vulnerable and entirely dependent on the nursing staff caring for him. On June 28, 2003, Charles Cullen injected a lethal dose of digoxin into Gall's IV line. The drug caused Reverend Gall's heart to fail, and he died within hours. His death was initially attributed to natural causes, as were most of Cullen's victims. Digoxin is a medication used to treat heart conditions, and in small doses, it is therapeutic. In the quantities Cullen administered, it was fatal. The pattern of deaths at Somerset Medical Center eventually caught the attention of hospital administrators. Mortality rates in the units where Cullen worked had spiked abnormally, and an internal review revealed that Cullen had been accessing the medication dispensary at unusual times and withdrawing drugs in quantities that could not be justified by his patient assignments. The hospital contacted law enforcement. Detectives Danny Baldwin and Tim Braun began investigating, but they needed evidence that would hold up in court. That evidence came from Amy Loughran, a co-worker and friend of Cullen's who had worked alongside him for years. When Loughran learned that Cullen was under investigation, she agreed to help. She wore a wire and recorded conversations in which Cullen admitted to killing patients. The recordings were clear and detailed. Cullen confessed to injecting patients with lethal medications, and he did so in a tone that suggested he believed he was providing a service. The recordings gave investigators the evidence they needed. Charles Cullen was arrested on December 12, 2003, at a restaurant in New Jersey. He was charged with murder and attempted murder. Rather than proceed to trial, prosecutors offered him a plea deal. If he agreed to confess to every murder he had committed and cooperate with investigators in identifying victims, they would not seek the death penalty. Cullen accepted. Over the course of multiple interviews, he sat with detectives and pointed out victims in medical files, many of whom the hospitals had never flagged as suspicious. The confession revealed that hospitals had known or suspected that Cullen was harming patients, but had chosen to quietly terminate his employment rather than report him. Those hospitals had then provided neutral or even positive references when Cullen applied for jobs elsewhere. The institutional cover-up allowed Cullen to continue killing for more than a decade. The plea deal was finalized in April 2004. Cullen pled guilty to multiple counts of murder and was sentenced to 18 consecutive life sentences with no possibility of parole. Families of the victims gave impact statements expressing their horror not only at Cullen's actions, but at the hospital's complicity. The courtroom heard testimony about patients who had gone into the hospital for routine procedures and never came home. Their deaths attributed to complications or natural causes, when in reality they had been murdered by their nurse. Cullen showed little emotion during the proceedings. The case became the subject of a book and a Netflix film titled The Good Nurse, which detailed Amy Loughran's role in bringing Cullen to justice. The impact of the case extended far beyond Cullen's conviction. Multiple hospitals faced lawsuits and public scrutiny for their failure to report him. The case exposed systemic failures in healthcare oversight, particularly the practice of providing neutral references to employees suspected of misconduct in order to avoid litigation. Reforms were implemented to improve reporting requirements and to ensure that healthcare workers who pose a danger to patients are flagged in national databases. But those reforms came too late for Reverend Florian Gall and the hundreds of other patients who died under Charles Cullen's care. Charles Cullen is 64 years old. He is incarcerated at New Jersey State Prison, where he is serving 18 consecutive life sentences with no possibility of parole. He will never be released. Amy Loughran's courage in wearing a wire and recording Cullen's confession saved lives and brought an end to a killing spree that had continued for 16 years. The hospitals that fired Cullen quietly and passed him along to the next employer bear responsibility for every death that occurred after they chose institutional self-preservation over patient safety. Charles Cullen killed with impunity because the institutions tasked with protecting patients chose instead to protect themselves. Case 8, Sean Vincent Gillis. In the spring of 2004, Baton Rouge, Louisiana was gripped by fear. A serial killer was operating in the city, targeting women and leaving their bodies in canals and along rural roads. Investigators were working around the clock to identify the killer, but the profile they had developed was confusing. Evidence from the crime scenes suggested two different offenders, not one. They were correct. Two serial killers were operating in Baton Rouge at the same time, hunting independently, and their overlapping timelines created an investigative nightmare. One of those killers was Derek Todd Lee, who would eventually be linked to multiple murders. The other was Sean Vincent Gillis, a 41-year-old web designer who lived an unremarkable life during the day and committed acts of extreme post-mortem mutilation at night. Gillis documented his crimes with a digital camera, keeping the photographs on his computer as trophies. When he was arrested in April 2004, he did not ask for a lawyer. Instead, he gave a breathless, highly detailed confession, eagerly revealing the locations of 8 murders that police had not fully connected. He bragged about his intelligence and provided information that closed multiple cold cases instantly. Sean Vincent Gillis was born on June 24, 1962, in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. He worked as a web designer, a job that required technical skill and allowed him to live a stable, middle-class life. He had no significant criminal history before the murders. To those who knew him, he was a normal, nerdy, quiet guy who kept to himself. He lived an unremarkable life on the surface, but what he did in private was anything but ordinary. One of his victims was Donna Bennett Johnston. She was 43 years old when she disappeared in February 2004. Johnston was battling addiction and walking late at night in Baton Rouge, vulnerabilities that made her a target. She was a person trying to survive in difficult circumstances, and she deserved better than what happened to her. Sean Gillis's crimes were marked by extreme violence. He strangled his victims, then subjected their bodies to post-mortem mutilation so severe that investigators initially believed they were dealing with someone who had medical or anatomical training. The mutilations were not random. They were calculated, methodical, and documented. Gillis brought a digital camera to the crime scenes and photographed what he had done. He kept the images on his computer, stored alongside his professional work files. Between 2000 and 2004, he killed 8 adult women in Baton Rouge, dumping their bodies in swamps and bayous throughout the area. His motive was severe sexual sadism and necrophilia. The crimes were premeditated, and he selected victims he believed would not be prioritized by law enforcement. Donna Bennett Johnston's body was found near a canal in February 2004. Investigators processed the scene and recovered a critical piece of evidence: tire tracks left in the mud near where the body had been dumped. The tracks were unique, matching a specific type of tire that was not commonly used in the area. Detectives ran the tire pattern through databases and identified a list of potential vehicles. One of those vehicles was registered to Sean Vincent Gillis. Investigators also had DNA evidence from earlier crime scenes, and they matched it to a swab that had been taken from Gillis during a routine traffic dispute. The DNA match was definitive. On April 29, 2004, police arrested Sean Gillis at his home in Baton Rouge. When detectives brought him in for questioning, he waived his right to an attorney and began talking immediately. What followed was a confession unlike anything investigators had heard before. Gillis was eager to share. He provided detailed descriptions of all 8 murders, drawing maps to show where he had dumped the bodies, and explaining his methods with a level of specificity that suggested he had been waiting for the opportunity to talk about what he had done. He bragged about his intelligence and seemed to take pride in the fact that he had evaded detection for as long as he had. The confession closed multiple cold cases that had been unsolved for years. Investigators had suspected the murders were linked, but Gillis provided the details that confirmed the connections and identified victims who had not yet been associated with the series. The trial was straightforward. Gillis had confessed to everything, and the digital photographs on his computer provided incontrovertible evidence. Prosecutors presented the confession, the photographs, and the DNA evidence. There was no viable defense. the jury convicted Sean Vincent Gillis of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Sean Vincent Gillis is 64 years old. He is incarcerated at Louisiana State Penitentiary in Angola, where he is serving a life sentence with no chance of release. The bizarre circumstance of two serial killers operating in the same city at the same time remains one of the most unusual aspects of the case. Investigators had been profiling a single offender, when in reality, they were hunting two men with entirely different methods and motives. The tire tracks in the mud and a DNA swab from a traffic stop led to Gillis's arrest. His eagerness to confess and his detailed knowledge of the crimes ensured that there would be no appeals, no lengthy legal battles, and no ambiguity about his guilt. Donna Bennett Johnston and 7 other women died in Baton Rouge at the hands of a man who documented their deaths with a camera and stored the images on his computer. The digital evidence, combined with his confession, guaranteed that Sean Gillis would spend the rest of his life in prison. Case 9. Joel Rifkin. On June 28, 1993, New York State troopers on patrol along a Long Island highway noticed a pickup truck with no rear license plate. It was a minor traffic violation, the kind that results in a ticket and nothing more. The troopers activated their lights and attempted to pull the truck over. The driver did not stop. Instead, he accelerated, leading the troopers on a brief chase that ended when the truck crashed into a utility pole. The driver, a 34-year-old man, stumbled out of the vehicle and was taken into custody. As the troopers approached the truck to inspect it, they were hit by an overwhelming smell. One of them lifted the tarp covering the truck bed and found the source. A woman's body, in an advanced state of decomposition, was lying in the back of the truck. The driver's name was Joel Rifkin, and he was about to confess to being the most prolific serial killer in New York history. He had been caught because of a missing $5 license plate. Joel David Rifkin was born on January 20th, 1959, in New York City. He was raised in a suburban home and grew up as a bullied loner who struggled to fit in socially. He was adopted, and his relationship with his adoptive family was strained. As an adult, he worked as a self-employed landscaper, a job that allowed him to set his own hours and avoid regular interaction with other people. He lived with his elderly mother in a house on Long Island. He had no significant criminal record before the murders began. To neighbors, he was unremarkable, a quiet man who kept to himself and seemed harmless. His first victim was Heidi Balch. She was 25 years old when Joel Rifkin killed her in 1989. Balch worked as a sex worker on the streets of New York City, a profession that left her vulnerable to predators like Rifkin. She was trying to survive, and she had no way of knowing that getting into a car with Rifkin would cost her her life. Rifkin's method was consistent across 17 murders. He picked up sex workers on the streets of New York City, brought them to his mother's house on Long Island, and strangled them manually in the house while his mother was away or asleep. After the women were dead, he dismembered their bodies using tools from his landscaping work. He disposed of the remains in oil drums, rivers, and along highways throughout Long Island and New Jersey. The crimes were motivated by necrophilia and a desire for control. He kept the bodies in his house for hours or even days before dismembering them. He also kept trophies, driver's licenses, bras, jewelry, and other personal items belonging to his victims. He stored these items in a box in his childhood bedroom, in the same house where his elderly mother lived. She had no idea what her son was doing. The murders went undetected for years. Rifkin's victims were marginalized women whose disappearances did not trigger intensive investigations. The bodies that were found were not immediately connected to a single killer because they were discovered in different jurisdictions and in various states of decomposition. Rifkin continued killing throughout the early 1990s, confident that he would not be caught. That confidence was shattered on June 28, 1993, when a routine traffic stop for a missing license plate led to the discovery of a decomposing body in his truck. He had been transporting the remains when the troopers pulled him over. Joel Rifkin was arrested at the scene and taken to a police precinct in Mineola, New York. He was handcuffed to a desk and questioned by detectives. He did not ask for a lawyer. Instead, he began to confess. Over the course of 12 hours, Rifkin provided a detailed account of 17 murders. He drew maps showing where he had dumped the bodies. He described his methods, explained how he had selected his victims, and provided information that allowed investigators to close dozens of cold cases that had been unsolved for years. The confession was comprehensive, matter-of-fact, and delivered without emotion. Rifkin seemed almost relieved to finally talk about what he had done. The interrogation closed case after case, as detectives realized they had been searching for a killer who had been operating under their noses for nearly a decade. The trial began with Rifkin pleading not guilty by reason of insanity. His defense attorneys argued that he was mentally ill and could not be held fully responsible for his actions. Prosecutors presented the evidence: the body in the truck, the trophies found in his childhood bedroom, and his own detailed confession. The jury heard testimony about the box of driver's licenses and jewelry that Rifkin had kept as souvenirs, stored in a room in a house he shared with his mother. They also heard the recordings of his confession, in which he described the murders in clinical detail. The insanity defense was rejected. The jury found Joel Rifkin guilty of multiple counts of murder, and he was sentenced to 203 years to life in prison. Joel Rifkin is 67 years old. He is incarcerated at Clinton Correctional Facility in New York, where he is serving a sentence that ensures he will never be released. The irony of his arrest remains one of the most striking details of the case. The most prolific serial killer in New York history was caught because of a $5 license plate, a piece of metal that he had neglected to attach to his truck. The traffic stop for a minor violation led to the discovery of a body, which led to a 12-hour confession that closed 17 murder cases. The box of trophies in his childhood bedroom, kept in the same house where his elderly mother lived, became one of the most disturbing pieces of evidence presented at trial. Heidi Balch and 16 other women died because Joel Rifkin strangled them in his mother's house and dismembered them with tools from his landscaping work. His meticulous confession provided closure to families who had been searching for answers for years. The missing license plate ended a killing spree that had lasted nearly a decade. Case 10. Carl Eugene Watts. In 2006, one of the deadliest serial killers in American history was only days away from being legally paroled and released back into society. Carl Eugene Watts had been convicted of burglary in Texas in 1982 and sentenced to 60 years in prison. That sentence should have kept him incarcerated until 2042. But Texas law at the time included a mandatory release provision that allowed inmates to earn early parole through good behavior. Watts had been a model prisoner, and under Texas law, he was scheduled to be released in May 2006 after serving less than half of his sentence. The problem was that Carl Watts had confessed to murdering more than 80 women. He had been given immunity for those confessions as part of a plea deal, a catastrophic legal decision that meant he could not be prosecuted for the murders he had admitted to committing. Prosecutors in Texas had offered him the deal because they did not have enough physical evidence to convict him of murder, and they believed a 60-year sentence for burglary was sufficient to keep him locked up. They were wrong. As the parole date approached, investigators in Michigan scrambled to find a way to stop the release. They found a single surviving witness to a 1979 murder and brought Watts to trial just weeks before he was scheduled to walk free. The trial succeeded. Carl Watts was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. He died 3 years later. Carl Eugene Watts was born on November 7, 1953, in Killeen, Texas. He dropped out of college and worked as a mechanic. He was diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder and had severe intellectual deficits. But he was functional enough to maintain employment and avoid drawing significant attention. He was quiet, kept to himself, and did not have a criminal record that suggested he was capable of murder. What no one knew was that Watts had developed a pathological hatred of women. He later told investigators that he heard voices telling him to kill, voices that he could not ignore. Between 1974 and 1982, he attacked women in public places, using a blitz-style assault method with a knife. He targeted women who were walking alone, often in the early morning hours on Sundays, earning him the nickname the Sunday Morning Slasher. He moved quickly, striking without warning and fleeing immediately. The attacks left very little forensic evidence, and witnesses rarely got a clear look at his face. One of his victims was Helen Dutcher. She was 36 years old in December 1979, a businesswoman who was walking alone at night in Ferndale, Michigan. She was a stranger to Watts, selected at random because she fit his preferred victim profile. She was vulnerable simply because she was walking alone in an alley, a decision that should not have cost her her life. On December 1st, 1979, Carl Watts attacked and killed Helen Dutcher in an alleyway in Ferndale. His method was a blitz-style knife attack, stabbing and slashing her repeatedly before fleeing the scene. Watts was convicted of 2 murders, but confessed to killing more than 80 adult women across multiple states. His motive was a pathological hatred of women, driven by what he described as voices in his head. The attacks were premeditated only in the sense that he selected victims in advance, but the actual killings were spontaneous and frenzied. He left almost no forensic evidence because he fled immediately after the attacks. And the public locations meant that witnesses heard screams, but rarely saw the killer. Helen Dutcher's murder was discovered when a witness heard her screams and called the police. By the time officers arrived, Watts was gone. The investigation went cold. Watts continued attacking women throughout Michigan, then moved to Texas, where he was eventually caught breaking into a woman's apartment in Houston on May 23, 1982. The woman survived, and Watts was arrested. Texas investigators linked him back to the Michigan murders, but they faced a problem. They did not have enough physical evidence to convict him of murder. The attacks had been too quick, the crime scenes too chaotic, and the forensic technology of the early 1980s too limited to provide definitive proof. Prosecutors made a decision that would haunt them for decades. They offered Carl Watts a plea deal if he confessed to all of his murders and provided details that would allow investigators to close cold cases. They would give him immunity from prosecution for those murders. In exchange, he would plead guilty to burglary and receive a 60-year sentence. Watts accepted. He gave a comprehensive confession, detailing dozens of murders across multiple states and providing information that allowed families to finally learn what had happened to their missing loved ones. He was sentenced to 60 years in prison for burglary, and prosecutors believed the case was closed. What they did not anticipate was that Texas law would allow Watts to earn early parole. By 2004, it became clear that Carl Watts was going to be released in 2006. Victims' families and law enforcement officials were horrified. Michigan authorities realized they had one chance to stop the release. They could try Watts for a murder that had not been covered by the immunity agreement. They identified Helen Dutcher's 1979 murder as a case they could prosecute. A surviving witness came forward, and Michigan prosecutors built a case. The trial took place in 2004, just months before Watts's scheduled parole date. Prosecutors presented the witness testimony and the evidence from the crime scene. Watts was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. The conviction prevented his release. Carl Eugene Watts died of prostate cancer on September 21, 2007, at the age of 53. He was incarcerated in a Michigan prison at the time of his death. The case remains one of the most shocking examples of a legal loophole, nearly releasing a serial killer back into society. The bad plea deal in Texas, which had granted immunity for confessions, meant that one of the deadliest killers in American history was scheduled to be paroled despite having admitted to more than 80 murders. The cold case detective who identified the surviving witness and brought the case to trial in 2004 prevented that release. Helen Dutcher's family waited 25 years for justice, and they received it only because investigators refused to allow a legal technicality to free her killer. Carl Watts died in prison 3 years later, his death ensuring that he would never have the opportunity to kill again.